Hi everyone. With this particular video, I was once again kind of in between projects, and essentially what's happening is I'm getting ready to do a book promotion series for my first two books. So each book gets its own promotion, and it's set up in such a way that I take different sections of the books, basically chapters, sub-chapters, and so on, and I release them once per day until I get through the whole book. And the idea with these book promotion series is that people can go and access individual parts of my book in a blog style promotion versus a PDF file that they can download and read offline. So it's basically online versus offline. One I can cite through hyperlinks, the other I can't as easily. So that's the main reason I'm doing it. I've been working on that the past couple of days, getting it ready. It's all set up, which means that basically from here on out, as far as that goes, I can devote each day to uploading one portion of each book until I get through both of them, which means that it's kind of set up so that I have some work to do, but I only have some work to do, which means that I have more free time to work on other stuff. And I thought I would do a video about liberals, specifically American liberalism, American liberals. This takes a lot of different forms, but I thought I would do a video where I'm kind of responding to that idea. What is a liberal? If someone says, I don't like liberals, for instance, what are they talking about? And the main reason I thought that I would do a video about that is I had a video where I was talking about August the Duck. He's a YouTube channel that I became familiar with for critiquing Cooking with Jack and a couple of other channels where he was basically making money by making fun of people who were bad cooks. But he also would get involved sometimes in politics, and I really didn't like his approach to muckraking or just talking about things politically, and he struck me as an American liberal. So this video was about that. We're not going to watch the video, but rather the inspiration for me doing this video talking about American liberals now was partly in response to a comment that I had gotten on this video that I made about August, as well as having watched The YouTubers Who Backed the Genocide by Noah Sampson, Brian F's Capcom Cop Destroyed All Expectations, and Bad Empanada's second channel, Bad Empanada Live, Dear Hassan Piker, It's Not Morality or Optics, It's End Results. So basically the follow-through with all of these videos is they all have something to do with American liberalism. And what I thought I would do is we would go over the comment here that inspired the whole thing, and then I would talk briefly about Noah's video and Brian's video. We're not going to watch those. And then we would conclude my video by watching Bad Empanada Live's Dear Hassan Piker and basically respond to it point by point. It's short enough that I feel like we can get through that and the other parts that I just talked about without making the video longer than, say, an hour. We'll see. This isn't scripted. It's just kind of off the cuff, but rather than just type out a response to this one person asking me about liberalism and why I think it sucks, I thought that we would basically respond to him or her or they, their talking points conversationally for a second, and then we'll go through the other parts. So with this video, the reason I made it initially was because August the Duck was responding specifically to Mr. Beast. And Mr. Beast was doing the evil Willy Wonka thing and making a bunch of money by selling really unhealthy food to kids, and not just his chocolate bars, but also his Lunchables, or whatever he calls them. They're sort of like the Beast version of Lunchables, but they're like kid snacks, and they're processed food that's sold in like plastic packaging to kids for middle-class America to buy up. They're relatively expensive, and they're incredibly unhealthy, even compared to other market brands. But the main reason that I was upset with him wasn't that, even though that's bad enough by itself. He has predatory business practices insofar as he promotes these products, but he also would hire sex offenders to work for his company on YouTube. And among other things, these individuals would be in front of the camera and he would be hiring them or rehiring them, basically deliberately giving pedophiles, registered pedophiles, job positions where they would have access to children. And so that's like super bad. And the reason I got upset at August the Duck was because he was like, Mr. Beast is too big to fail, so we shouldn't really waste a lot of time talking about him. And I thought that that was incredibly stupid. And furthermore, a white liberal kind of thing to say. White liberal, a liberal is basically a moderate, a centrist, someone who is a moderate Republican, essentially. Oftentimes you have Democrats who will belong technically to the Democratic Party, but they function as moderate Republicans, and Republicans are Nazis, which makes moderate Republicans, aka Democrats, just establishment Democrats like Joe Biden and Joe Manchin and other people like them, little more than moderate Nazis. That's what a liberal is. A liberal American is someone who, through a centrist refrain, is strange bedfellows with Nazis. It's white knight, black knight, good cop, bad cop. They're both cops. All cops are bad. So that's a nice, simple way of articulating what a liberal is. To that, August the Duck is essentially a liberal because he is apologizing for certain individuals. In his case, he was specifically apologizing for Mr. Beast, who's a capitalist. He's someone who's doing a lot of shitty things. And August the Duck's response is, he's too big to fail, so we shouldn't say anything about him. We shouldn't do anything. It's a waste of time. Essentially, activism is a waste of time. And that's a very shitty approach to take. It's the same kind of thing that happened to Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, where the biggest enemy of progress, according to Martin Luther King in a letter from the Birmingham jail, were white moderates. Now, you can have other forms of moderates these days because tokenism has expanded moderacy to formerly marginalized groups, which means that they've gentrified and decayed to include certain tokenized talking heads like Candace Owens or Ben Shapiro, or even people like August the Duck. Now, in August the Duck's case, he's a white moderate, a straight white man specifically, so he was never marginalized. He has white male privilege, so he's the most privileged group in America. So when someone like this is basically making liberal talking points, centrist talking points that are discouraging activism against people who are doing shitty things, it is very much something that I disagree with. And furthermore, real quick, if we go to my channel here, there was something else that I wanted to talk about real quick. There was a post to a video this person says sex work isn't empowering, and they go on to say that sex work isn't empowering largely because, it's policed, it's stigmatized. If you do it, you can be blacklisted from other forms of employment. Basically, don't do sex work because it's something that can lead you to being oppressed. And this kind of argument, I thought of it just now because it's another form of liberalism, where they're like, don't do this, it can lead you to being oppressed. When in reality, we're already oppressed, and a lot of people who do sex work, for instance, are basically trying to survive because there's people who do sex work, they moonlight it. It's like a side gig for them, and they're very secretive about it. And then there are people who do sex work as survival sex workers, and they can't afford to be secretive. But furthermore, it's often tied to their identity. So the idea, I say here, so let me get this straight. Something isn't empowering if the state punishes you for doing it. Why rebel at all then? Liberation is punched down against regardless. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. There's also survival sex work to consider. So liberalism makes all these sort of reasoned arguments. If it's not about sex work being empowering, it's about activism more broadly that could be tied to sex work, but also other forms of activism, like going after Tesla, for instance, and various other, whistleblowing, muckraking, various companies, going after the police state, any form of activism you could think of. So we do it because it's empowering in the long run. It's in our best interest in the long run to do that. And the reason that August the Duck doesn't care to do it is because he's so privileged that it doesn't matter, and he'd rather make money talking about other things. And that'll bring us to Noah Sampson talking about these YouTubers and Brian F., where essentially, to summarize both videos quite quickly, Brian F. is a white cishet man who is an announcer for a giant company, a video game company, Capcom. He works for them, and he's an announcer for their gladiatorial circuit. So when they have Capcom Cup, which it had $1 million prize, Capcom Cup 11, and you had various people competing for it, he's talking about that and nothing else. So for him, the idea of the news is this person here, Blaz from Chile, and this person, Kakeru from Japan, were competing for first place in grand finals of Capcom Cup. And the title of the video is Capcom Cup Destroyed All Expectations and Our Predictions. And Brian F. is talking with Hollywood Rob TV, and they're talking about that in the middle of a genocide, mind you, with Gaza going on, and Brian F. has 160,000 subscribers. I don't know how many Hollywood Rob has, but probably a similar amount. A little less, a little more. I'm not sure. But the two of them are talking about this. They're smiling, they're laughing, they're making money. Making hay while the sun shines in the middle of a genocide. This is what they're talking about. Nothing else exists for them on their platforms. So instead of using their platforms to do activism, they're using their platforms to make money, specifically through gladiatorial esports, where you have a person from Chile who was competing for $1 million, from the global south, and then someone from Japan, the global north, and it's basically a form of assimilation fantasy, a form of gatekeeping. There can only be one. And while I like the idea of Blaz, for instance, using the money to help his community, very similar to someone like Manny Pacquiao in boxing, I believe Manny was from the Philippines. Pac-Man would, through his championship money, buy houses for people in his community. So philanthropy is definitely important, but if you have a platform like that, it shouldn't just be something that you speak through war personified. In boxing, it was the squared circle. Fighting games, that take the same idea, but it applies it to avatars and video game esports. But if you have a large platform, you should also use it to talk about various other things. And I recognize, of course, that they would not get sponsored, they would not be employed if they did that, but at the same time, they don't take any kind of step to talk about politics. Even Brian F. is someone who's talking about Saudi Arabia and the politics of that country and saying, you should look into that. Like, he'll have these moments where he'll say things politically, but he won't talk about Gaza. So he's definitely liberal in that respect, where, hey, things are good. We're eating good, boys, as long as we get to watch Capcom Cup. That's all that they care about. They don't care about being active, and that sucks. They suck, as far as I'm concerned, because if you want to know what you would be doing, say, during the Nazi Reich, it's what you're doing right now, because a similar genocide is going on overseas in Gaza. The same idea applies to Noah Sampson's video, where he is talking about the YouTubers who backed a genocide, and he has images of Destiny, Loaderbox, Turkey Tom, this guy, and Ethan Klein. I don't watch these guys, so I don't have all their names memorized. But in any event, Destiny is a Zionist. Lonerbox was basically riding his coattails. Turkey Tom is an American centrist, which makes him a Zionist. Liberals and Zionists are the same goddamn thing. And they're not functionally any different. They're making hay while the sun shines. Some of them will talk about political topics when it suits them, when by and large, people like Turkey Tom, this guy, whose his name again I can't remember, they largely talk about video games. They're apolitical, which means to say that they're political, that they're actually political, political not being in quotes, and they're Gamergate types, you know, the kind that started to emerge in the early 2010s around Gamergate, and they're, you know, liberals are moderate Nazis, which is to say they're Nazis with masks, and they'll talk about political subjects to defend the status quo when it suits them. Turkey Tom is racist. He talks about various degenerate people, like what he calls degenerate, which is a Nazi dog whistle, when he's talking about furries and various other fandoms, which, again, is just him, a white, straight guy punching down at minorities. Same idea with this person. Ethan Klein is a Zionist. He's a Jewish man who, as far as I understand it, is living in Israel. He'll punch down at basically various subclasses or underclasses in Israel, including other Jewish people, because in the eyes of the Zionist state, the ethno-state of Israel, not all Jews are created equal, because if you're not a Western Jew like Ethan Klein, who is originally from America, you're lesser. And there's a gradient and a spectrum to that. And Destiny and Lonerbox also went to Israel. I think Lonerbox and Destiny they split up at this point for various reasons. I think Destiny slept with Lonerbox's girlfriend or something like that, so they didn't split up for political reasons. It was much more petty than that, though I will say that Destiny is a sex pest, so it's a legitimate reason to be mad at someone if they sleep with your girlfriend. But I thought for 1 second that Destiny Box grew a spine and said, you know what, I disagree with you politically. I'm going to start moving away from that. And specifically, these two people like to say that they're more progressive when they're really not. And even Ethan Klein, to some extent, likes to say that he's an ally of the Palestinians, ergo more progressive, when he's not. And Noah Sampson, someone who is actually surprised me quite a bit. He's someone who has subscribed to Bad Empanada. And Bad Empanada, say what you will about him in regards to some of his politics. He makes Stalinist arguments in regards to sexuality, which and gender expression, especially American forms thereof. And we'll get into it a little bit when we watch his video, Dear Hassan Piker. But his arguments regarding post-colonialism and what's happening in Gaza are absolutely spot on. So Noah Sampson has been responding to that, and he takes the time to basically critique all of these white liberals and token liberals in this person's case, and in the case of Ethan Klein, where he's Jewish, but he's basically a white American guy who had a Jewish ancestry, but he's a Western American Jew as opposed to someone who's like an Arab Jew living in Israel. So there are different degrees. These are modular components, but they often intersect. But Noah Sampson is basically taking a lot of what Bad Empanada said, or just the pretext of Bad Empanada's videos. He recommends them, but he does a lot of his own research. We don't have time to watch that. It's a very good video, though. It's just very straight to the point. He's just sitting in front of a camera and giving it like it is. He gives a lot of sources, a lot of visual aids. It's very well done. Go and watch it. I'm very pleased with Noah Sampson's progress and him speaking out about the genocide in Gaza this entire time and taking those who are profiting off it to task. It's an excellent video, which is to say that Noah Sampson himself is not a liberal, but all of these people on screen are. Going back to August the Duck here, I said in the description of my video, just a trans woman Ancom's rant about why I think August the Duck sucks, as does the whole Mr. Beast situation. As a survivor of abuse myself, I wanted to weigh in and talk about the allegations of abuse that August thinks are just drama. According to him, a 22-year-old centrist with a sizable YouTube channel. It's gross, and his approach to the situation is really dumb and harmful. And then I go on to link Mr. Beast is censoring the truth. and I think this was a video by August the Duck. I also respond to Dogpacks 404's latest video, I Worked for Mr. Beast, He's a Sociopath, where he interviews a victim of Mr. Beast, Jake Weddle. I Worked for Mr. Beast, He's a Sociopath. And someone watched my video. I don't have a very large subscriber count. I have like 724 subscribers, and this video has 349 views, for instance. But someone responded to it. And this person, Elysium Music 6C6B, responded. And they said, I mean this in the kindest way possible, but I think that you just might need to take a break from the internet. August does not take himself very seriously and doesn't expect people to take him seriously. I'm truly trying to be nice here, but I would just take a little step back. And first of all, no. But second, I responded. You don't get to have it both ways. Homeboy tries to do activism and says it's not political or whatever. I don't care what he thinks. Everything is political. I'm politically active and happy to critique people like him. He's not the end-all be-all of existence. He's a white liberal or suckdem at best. Plenty to critique there. Elysium responds, I completely understand that. I just don't understand what's wrong with being liberal. Or is it just the fact that he's white? I'm in the LGBT community and am pro-life. Okay, so. Alright. I respond, you're not of the LGBT, are you? I only ask because you say LGBT versus LGBTQ. In any event, liberals apologize for whitewash genocide, i.e. they're not the sworn enemies of fascists, but strange bedfellows complicit in capital's daily operations. R.E. centrism, American exceptionalism impacts Americana, whose end result is endless division, profit, and military conquest behind the usual neoliberal veneers, capitalist realism. Such realism and its effects can only exist through the kinds of state apologia that liberals live for. Liberals suck. And then we get to the question that inspired this video. Elysium says, I'm an outsider, left, but no, I'm not LGBT, I'm just LGBTQ. Can you explain a little bit more in detail why you think liberal beliefs are bad? What's wrong with not wanting women to be prevented from getting an abortion? What's wrong with freedom of speech? Most conservatives are against hip-hop music. What's wrong with hip-hop music? I'm truly curious of your belief. So these questions are straw man because they're basically saying, well, what's wrong with this? Implying that I said that. Liberals' beliefs are bad because they'll have the veneer of morality, but then they'll apologize for genocide. And they do that in ways that respond exactly the way that this person, Elysium, is responding. They're like, what's the matter? Don't you think that women should be able to get abortions? Yes, I do. What's the matter? Don't you like freedom of speech? Yes, I do. Most conservatives are against hip-hop music. What's wrong with hip-hop music? I don't know. I'm not conservative. I'm not against hip-hop music. Like, there's a conversation to be had with any of these topics where they can be hot-button issues that become basically single voter issues where someone will single vote for one issue, but then they'll be against everything else. But that's not really a problem with the issue. It's how the issue is being framed and used as a political weapon. Liberals will do that. Well, they'll be like, well, I'm pro-life, like Elysium says here. And they are in the LGBT community, so they're gay or they're lesbian or they're bisexual, but they aren't, and they're pro-life. But they're like, well, that's enough. I did that. I can excuse this, but I'm all against this. And it's like, no, a bigotry for one is a bigotry for all. And that's how liberals work. It's the Omelas refrain. Ursula K. Le Guin, where those who walk away from Omelas walk away from a city where at least one group or a child, specifically in Omelas, is held in the basement and tortured. And those who walk away from Omelas walk away from any instance where something like that is occurring. So if you have, in this case, it's the Gazans. America can exist because it exploits the Gazans, but it also exploits people in Syria, people in the global south more broadly, people in America. So domestic and foreign examples of this occur all the time. America is a settler colony. It's a police state, and it's largely run by corporations that rely on American liberals to run interference for them. And incidentally, if you want a lot more information about that, watch this video, because it doesn't just talk about these YouTubers, it also talks about various publications like the New York Post and the Guardian and a couple of others that will use lies of omission and a whitewashing of genocidal language, calling it the Israel-Hamas war, for instance. It's not a war, it's a genocide. And what they're doing is what various pundits back in the 60s and 70s would have done in America when America entered the Vietnam War, and various people would call it a war, other people would call it a genocide. And this can be found in any war throughout American history where America wages war as a business, and it will frame that as a good war. The Vietnam War is only bad in the eyes of liberals because America lost it. But then you had the Korean War, you had the Afghan War, you had the invasions of Iraq, and throughout that entire period after World War II onwards, you also had the formation of Israel and its ethno-state, which America has backed ever since. So these are all genocides. Like, war for business is, reliant on genocide, is something that liberals apologize for. So Noah Sampson's video is very direct. It gives a lot of very good examples. It obviously focuses on Gaza first and foremost, and these figures, as well as the publications that they work for or otherwise are in the periphery supporting. Like, they all, support each other. One hand washes the other, basically. Edward Snowden in regards to the different parts of government, but also the different parts of corporations and the people who, in some shape or form, work for those corporations. That can be newscasters, but also streamers. People sitting in front of a screen, they're literally talking heads. And a lot of them will try and mask what they're doing, and they don't really care about politics except when it can make them money. So someone like Turkey Tom or this other guy are gamers first, and they're like, oh, I'm apolitical, but then they go on to make political statements that apologize for genocide. There, as Noah Sampson says, anti-genocide. Whereas Lonerbox and Destiny and Ethan Klein were more like political streamers. In Lonerbox's case, he would do video essays sometimes. And Lonerbox is kind of a strange case because he would incorporate through obscurantism a lot of socialist language and communist language to talk about the history of fascism and communism in Great Britain, but then he would basically functionally side with fascism by having that bigotry for one. And that bigotry for one, in this case, would be Gaza. Like, this guy's a hardcore Zionist. Destiny's a Zionist. And Ethan Klein, they're all Zionists, but they take that moderate Zionism. They're American liberals that try and say, oh, I'm not a Zionist. I'm for, at least in Ethan Klein's case, he says, I'm for the Palestinians. I care about them. I just want them to not live. I'm for a two-state solution. Well, a two-state solution is the Zionist solution. It's literally saying, the Nazis already took some of Poland, so I'm for the Polish, but the Nazis are already here, so I think we should try and compromise with the colonizer. So it's a real shitty argument, but it's very effective. And so Ethan Klein, Lonerbox, and Destiny are all Zionists. These assholes are gamers, which is to say, they're Zionists functionally, but they probably wouldn't go out and say, I'm a Zionist, because they probably don't know what the word means, but they don't have to make these kinds of talking points. Even if they're behind several veils, even if it's, obscured, they're still making arguments in favor of Israel. Because if you're defending people like Destiny, if you're going after Hassan Piker, for instance, Noah Sampson talks about that too, where Hassan Piker is someone who is a streamer who's pro-Palestine and is very openly pro-Palestine, and he's not perfect, and Bad Empanada in his Dear Hassan Piker video will talk about that. But in Noah's video, he talks about how Hassan Piker is someone to farm views against by basically saying Hassan Piker sucks, destiny's cool. It's, you know, it's a us versus them kind of argument. And while you can critique Hassan Piker through valid statements that, you know, recognize that he is pro-Palestine, but sometimes his approach is like a sock dem kind of approach. He's not a liberal per se, but he's also not very left-leaning ultimately. He's not nearly radical enough, because he'll say just enough to be recognized as radical in ways that have someone like Noah Sampson defend him, but not so much that Bernie Sanders or AOC won't come on his podcast or his stream and be interviewed. You know, he says just enough to be identified a particular way. He's just far enough left that he can be recognized as a particular, you know, leftist on YouTube, but not so much that he's recognized as a terrorist. Because right now, for instance, Donald Trump is going after people who refuse to buy Tesla and calling them domestic terrorists. And what's going to happen is there are various people that, even if they're not really that left of center, are probably going to be called terrorists too, if not already. In Hassan Piker's case, he would talk about the Houthis and their activism in the Red, I forget which sea it was. It might have been the Red Sea. Could be wrong on my oceanography, but there's a particular body of water where they were engaging in piracy to blockade Israel. And Hassan was like for that. And these other people, these three, were like, actually, terrorism is bad insofar as anyone who helps the Palestinians in a demonstrable way through piracy is bad. You know, it's a freedom fighter is only a freedom fighter in the state's eyes if it serves the state's interests. So these guys are saying that pirates are bad if they don't serve state interests, whereas Israel can engage in terrorist activities like blowing up all those pagers, which is a highly organized state-backed terrorist activity. That's what ethno-state is. It's just state-backed terrorism. And in this case, it's official terrorism as opposed to stochastic terrorism. It's mainstream. So these guys make that argument, and then these assholes defend it. So that's, in a nutshell, basically how liberalism works. And people like Hassan Piker or Noah Sampson can speak out against that to a certain degree. Noah Sampson's an interesting case because he doesn't actually go after Hassan Piker very much. He just talks about him as basically the punching bag for these five clowns. But he also is responding in good faith to Bad Empanada and talking about how Bad Empanadas work regarding the Palestinian cause and crisis is a good thing. So Noah Sampson's doing really good work. Watch his video. And now we're going to get to, ta-da, Bad Empanada. Bad Empanada is someone I've talked about on my channel before. He's made Stalinist arguments in the past in regards to people who talk about sex like it's their main interest. According to him, they should be dealt with, make it illegal again, which is to say, queer people more broadly. Under Stalin's reign and Stalin's purges, he made homosexuality and by extension all queerness illegal in 1933, which was the same year that the Germans burned down Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute of Sexology. So Bad Empanada is someone who has defended that, and the posts where he talks about that are posts that I have gone after. So I guess since I'm talking about it, we can open that up, go to my channel here, go to posts, and if we scroll down, let's see, where is it here? Yeah, okay. So 6 months ago, Bad Empanada was making a video, and I can't remember the video itself, but the screen caps, people who talk about sex, like you can just go down to this little post and click on the video yourself. I guess we'll just click on it because I'm curious. Okay, no, this is literally just a post that he did. So if we click on the post, you can see me responding to it. And just going back to what I say, as a sex worker, activist, and BDSM doctor, I'm not sure how to feel here. And he says, BDSM, doctor, that's not a fucking thing. Jesus Christ. Apparently Bad Empanada doesn't know what sex therapists are. And, but I respond to that. And I guess we may as well just click on the whole thing here. But I reply to him and I say, Bad Empanada, I'm an independent researcher who wrote my postgraduate work on the Gothic ludology, Marxism, and BDSM. I have multiple books out about sex positivity and BDSM. Kind of an odd mix, but BDSM is absolutely a part of the work that I do. And you're right, I don't have an office or work at university, but I do come from an academic background that branched off into non-academic work that I'm trying to share with people to help make others more sex positive and left-leaning in the fight towards liberation for different marginalized groups sexualized under capital. I should add that I don't engage with minors, no minors, minors DNI, for the usual sex worker style, and the vast majority of my work is on my 18 and up website, which I can even link to on YouTube. I think your post is referring to sex pests on YouTube, whose young audiences they prey off of while calling themselves leftists, which I agree is entirely wrong. My work is basically entirely off-site, and while I view it as strictly educational and made for purposes of satire and critique, based on my academic and non-academic extracurricular work, it's something I predominantly discuss with other sex workers. So this is what I wrote 6 months ago, but then I went on to write an entire book chapter responding to Bad Empanada and recognizing if you're making an argument that Stalin would make, you're a tankie and a Marxist Leninist, and I'm an American ANCOM who's very radical, and I'm against American liberalism, I'm against fascism, I'm against Marxist Leninism, and I'm essentially what I would call a Gothic gay anarcho-communist. So it's a very specific form of communism, but if you just wanted to be a little bit broader, I'm an ANCOM. And I talk about that kind of stuff. And Marxist Leninists and ANCOMs don't tend to get along. And that's something that happened with Bad Empanada and myself. He's sometimes referred to himself as an ANCOM, but he'll turn his nose up at American ANCOMs and basically say that anyone from the first world is liberal, and he'll act holier than thou, even though he's a straight white guy from Australia and he moved to Argentina. But, he is not above or exempt from criticism. But I will say that his videos on Gaza are excellent. He talks about Jewish exceptionalism and standing up for the rights of Arabs around the world, combating Islamophobia vis-a-vis Zionism, including not just like right and left Zionism, which Noah Sampson also recognizes is a myth. It's like Noah Sampson describes the right Zionists as basically just being for our soldiers should be able to do whatever they want. They should be able to rape people. They should be able to kill them, kill women and children, rape women and children, rape men. It doesn't matter. That's the right side of Israel. Whereas the left side of Israel is functionally Zionist, left Zionists versus right Zionists. Left Zionists are basically for a two-state solution, and they are saying they'll apologize less for the state, but they still want the state to be able to colonize Gaza and the West Bank, which it can't do without doing all of these things. So that they're functionally no different from each other. And this is something that Hassan Piker doesn't say nearly enough. So Noah Sampson's actually more radical functionally than Hassan Piker. But he's also recognizing that these people are milking Hassan Piker through basically, treating him as a punching bag. So Noah Sampson is engaging in good faith with Bad Empanada's work and recognizing how valuable it is to the Gazan cause, the Palestinians, and I would agree his work is quite good. What I don't agree with is the way that he punches down against ANCOMs more broadly, because he doesn't just go after liberal American ANCOMs, what he calls liberal polycule ANCOMs, we'll get to that in a second here, but also just like ANCOMs more broadly. Even though he's called himself one, he often sounds a lot more like Marxist Leninist in spots. He'll apologize for Russia and China to a certain extent. And, by and large, often his apologia is limited to, well, they do imperialism, but it's not nearly as bad. And I would be like, okay, if they're attenuating that over time and they're shrinking, imperialistic influence and they're moving away basically from imperialism and state capital, that's good. But he doesn't talk about that. He just talks about how there are cases of imperialism done by China and Russia in the past, like the Holodomor famine, for instance. He's like, it's not a genocide, it's a famine. Well, a shitload of people still died with a great leap forward, same idea. And so Bad Empanada is kind of a tankie when it comes to a lot of shit, but he's absolutely on the fucking money when it comes to Jewish exceptionalism and when it comes to the Gaza genocide. So, all of that being said, Bad Empanada and Noah Sampson and Hassan Piker are not liberals, though I will say that out of the three of them, Hassan Piker is easily the biggest and most successful, and he thinks that, optics and reaching across the aisle, like he's definitely the most sockdem of the bunch. Whereas Noah Sampson's actually pretty radical at this point in regards to his content, and he talks about sexuality and gender, but also geopolitics in a way that's holistically more left-leaning, whereas Bad Empanada, I would argue, is much more concessional towards state imperialism regarding China and Russia before and after the fall of the Soviet Union. He tends to apologize more for that, and he's well within his rights to critique America, but he also views people who live in America like we're all, liberals, and that's just not true. I am anything but a liberal. So all of that being said, I thought we should respond to, Dear Hassan Piker, it's not morality or optics, it's end results. So basically, dialectical materialism, intent doesn't matter, morality, argumentation doesn't matter, because morality arguments are arbitrated, they are subjective, but end results do, material results do. So it's a very Marxist approach to things. But let's watch it and see what he says.
Reacted to my video on him by literally making my name like a word that if you type it into his chat.
Oops.
So Hassan Piker reacted to my video on him by literally making my name like a word that if you type it into his chat, you will be instantly banned for. So that's interesting. But aside from that, there was this liberal Zionist who calls himself an anarchist, very typical American polycule liberal sort of thing, who responded to me to defend.
Okay, so to be clear, Bad Empanada says this person calls themselves an anarchist, but then he says it's a liberal polycule sort of thing. So Bad Empanada sometimes has kind of a big mouth, and he'll say things in such a way where he'll be like polycule, and he uses that almost as like it's a buzzword of sorts, and it's like, well, I'm in a polycule, I'm poly, so it's like you could just call them, a liberal who's posturing or something like that. So the idea of the liberal polycule kind of thing, it's very similar to like people who talk about sex like it's their main interest. He often has like this Maoist, Stalinist kind of approach to sexuality, which again is a mark of his Marxist Leninist tendencies, his tankie approach to things. Tankies tend to be not very sex positive, if I'm being honest. Again, the state is straight, and they apologize for the state through party politics. And that's not just something that Bad Empanada is guilty of, but also Hakim, Ugopnik, and Second Thought. They all kind of do that. And there's other instances of that as well. But Bad Empanada is right in that liberals can oftentimes adopt various singular aspects of, sex positivity or just seemingly liberatory politics, but they'll only adopt one or two examples of that. And they'll be like, don't worry, guys, I'm in a polycule. So I think that's me trying to steelman Bad Empanada here, but I think that's what he's saying.
Defend the honor of Hassan Piker. And I challenged him to a debate live on the topic. Of course, he refused. But
I will say, Bad Empanada, that I will happily debate you. I would love to debate you. Part of the problem is that we're in agreement about a lot of things, but there are a couple of things that I would like to debate you on, if you got the guts for it. But only if you got the guts for it, especially your tanky kind of tendencies, and you'll basically talk about various forms of politics and Russia and China and imperialism, and you'll be like, well, they're less bad than the United States. And that's true, and I would argue that regardless of how we feel about these instances, China is the global superpower economically at this point. They've outpaced the United States. American imperialism is ending, which is a good thing. It had to happen a particular way through fascism, which is imperialism come home to empire. The empire is in decay. But I would also be leery about other forms of state capitalism at this point. Nominal communism, which is basically what China is. They still do imperialism, and a lot of if you do imperialism, you're a capitalist. And that's just the fact of the matter. They have billionaires in China. It's structured differently, and I would argue, well, let's see how things play out, because there are some very powerful people in China that stand to get a lot more powerful if it continues to decay. So I'm curious to see how that plays out. I'd love to talk with you about that in good faith. It's not something I'm as knowledgeable about, so I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. But I would also like to talk about what you said before about dealing with people who talk about sex like it's their main interest. And also, if you still don't know what sex doctors are, BDSM doctors, sex therapists, because it's a huge blind spot. It's a huge knowledge gap in regards to what you talk about. And oftentimes you have kind of a big mouth. So yeah, debate me. I'd love to debate you.
But what he did is he instead did like a 3-hour-long reaction to my video critiquing Hassan. So we're going to go over a small portion of his reaction, not all of it, because I'm not going to sit here responding to a fucking anarchist liberal for 3 hours. To make a few...
So anarchist liberal. Again, he's also using the word anarchist, like anarchist liberal, like, or you could just call him a liberal. Or a progressive, so again, Marxist Leninist approach. Marxist Leninists tend to be allergic to ancoms and sexuality, polycules, stuff like that. You could just call him a liberal.
Things very clear that need to be made clear. I have this guy noted down as polycule guy, because that's what he is. So you might...
Are you not in a polycule, Bad Empanada? Are you against sex? I'm legitimately curious, because when I was writing about you in particular, you're someone who will oftentimes, you'll investigate certain people, low-hanging fruit, and go after them, but you never actually talk about anyone who's sex positive. You never actually talk about anarcho-communism insofar as if it's not someone who's a liberal ancom or a liberal polycule guy. You only talk about sexuality and liberal sexuality insofar as a liberatory sexuality insofar as it's attached to liberalism or sex pests or leftists operating in so-called leftists who are actually just centrists or right-leaning grifters acting in bad faith. So I'm awfully kind of curious about that, actually.
I know the sort of person that I'm talking about here. These are the anarchists, generally white anarchists in the USA who love standpoint epistemology. They love therapy speak. They especially love using terms like restorative and restorative justice and abolition, and they never get to the crux of what that actually means.
So at this point, Bad Empanada is specifically talking about liberals who abuse this kind of language to whitewash themselves and their agenda as white moderates. It's a strategy that goes back to the civil rights movement. And it affects any kind of activism that you could think of. So he's not wrong insofar as liberals do this, but he deliberately couches that within ANCOMs, specifically Western American ANCOMs, even though Bad Empanada has called himself an anarcho-communist before, and he's from Australia, which basically makes him of the West, even though it's on a particular part of the globe, it's a Western colony. And even if he moved to Venezuela, he still came from the West. He's a first worlder, he's an expat. He's someone with privilege. So, but he's making this argument specifically towards liberals, but he's couching it within the ANCOM sort of identity, which I think is a mistake. But he's a Marxist-Leninist functionally, so what more do you expect?
All of it is basically an excuse for them to use nice sounding language to excuse IDF veterans and American soldiers and stuff like that. And they never...
Yes, I would agree that liberals do that. And ANCOMs don't do that because ANCOMs are against the state. You're not going to be for the IDF if you're actually ANCOM. If you're functionally anarcho-communist, you're not going to be supporting a state-sanctioned genocidal project. It doesn't make any sense.
Never actually get into what the fuck do you even mean by all these terms that you're using. So this guy begins by complaining that people said bad things about an IDF soldier or something. He's responding to a tweet by an American union saying, learn why this former IDF soldier is voting yes on strike authorization tomorrow. So first things first, before we begin here, why the fuck is a former IDF soldier being elevated here? This is not a moralistic question. A lot of you do not seem to be able to think of things outside of moralism. Is he deserving of this?
Well, and the idea of morality, the way that I see it as an ANCOM, is morality is worker rights versus states' rights. And worker rights extends to the rights of the environment, animals, and nature, and those treated of nature through Cartesian rhetoric, heteronormativity, and secular colonialism. So those are things that, like morality is defined through those constellation points. The way that I would connect all of that is basic human, animal, and environmental rights versus the states. So states' rights versus worker rights. Again, that's how I would frame morality. It's not objective insofar as there are various forces at work. There are objective material aspects, but they're sort of worked out socially, which grants them a subjective element or a political element, a socio-political element that has a subjective component. So it's not just objective morality, because then you're ignoring the political aspect of it, which operates in duality. You can have the same exact language and have it be abused by liberals, by people like you who are calling liberals ANCOMs when they're functionally not. I'm an ANCOM. I don't know who you're talking about, but they don't sound like one. And you're not even one, really. And you're pretty radical in certain respects, but there's also certain things that you're not radical in regards to. So, yeah.
That's not what this is about at all. This is about what does doing this affect? What happens because of this? Firstly, you present an IDF soldier as like a potential ally. You make people conceive of IDF soldiers as potential allies. You discourage people from fighting the fucking IDF. That's one. Two is, what are this guy's actual views? Like, what are the average views of someone like this? We can surmise, we can guess, without using him specifically as an example. The average views of people like this, like Israeli, supposedly pro-Palestinian activists.
What he would call a moderate Zionist.
A liberal Zionism. They will use terms like the occupation and the settlers. What these terms mean is the West Bank and Gaza. So you normalize views like this, you elevate them. Like, if you had a liberal Zionist talking about how he is against the settlements and the occupation, and he was not Israeli, think about, would you give him like a platform and especially like highlight him if your goal is not merely a shitty two-state solution where the only bad, like the only thing that happens is like in the West Bank and Gaza? No.
Sorry, I had to pause it a couple of times. I needed to make sure that I was still recording. That's kind of important.
No, you wouldn't. I mean, I hope you wouldn't, unless you're a liberal Zionist. So why then do we have an Israeli ex-IDF soldier, no less, being platformed here to say this sort of thing, when we know fully well that his goals are likely completely out of line with ours? The effect of this is normalization.
Yeah, so the idea is that this is basically a form of obscurantism, where they're taking language and making it sound left-leaning. You're taking the language of the colonized and using it against them in ways that are functionally a Trojan horse with fascists inside, because that's what liberals are. So as far as that goes, they are using that kind of thing to assimilate and control opposition. So that's something to keep in mind, and as we proceed here.
The effect of this is normalizing the existence of Israel, normalizing peace without justice, normalizing Zionist goals. That's what you get from this. It's not some moralistic question on who deserves to speak. It's one of actual practice, and you guys don't seem to...
Well, they go hand in hand, right? Because, the idea that we should listen to people who practice what they preach, there is validity in saying, like, okay, we should listen to people who practice what they preach versus people who don't. So there is still an element of optics.
To understand that when I talk about challenge
Sorry about that. I do a lot of work with sex workers, so I have to schedule shoots, and I'm getting notifications for that as I'm recording this video, so that's why I had to pause again. But yeah, he's absolutely right insofar as, like, we obviously want to focus on people who are practicing what they preach, but we also have to recognize that there's a politics going on, you know, a discourse, a dialectic of you, if you will, of people who say whether or not they deserve to speak, which would go insofar as to say they're acting in bad faith, which we have to take into consideration. I deserve to speak because I'm acting in bad faith, because I'm a liberal. Liberals, that's what they do. So just something to keep in mind, something that I would add to.
Challenging Jewish exceptionalism. I'm talking about challenging, because if you don't fucking challenge it, you're going to get worse in South Africa. If that's what you want, then you're a Zionist. It's that simple. Now, you're going to see this guy use a lot of like buzzwords like solidarity, restorative justice here, and he's not going to say much because he's a polycule liberal.
He could just say a white moderate. He says polycule liberal. I find that awfully kind of confusing. You know, it's like, just say white moderate. You know, it makes a lot more sense. Or just moderate more broadly, a liberal, but saying a polycule liberal. It's like, okay, well, what about liberals who aren't in a polycule? You know, that's another thing, is he's using a subcategory when he's painting in a very broad brush, and I think that's a bad idea.
He doesn't have much to say. He has a lot of emotion. He has a lot of appeals to empathy and sympathy. He doesn't have a lot to say about actual action, about effective strategies. And when I say effective strategies, I don't mean compromised. I mean getting what we actually should be aiming for. A lot of you guys, like, you come from Hassan and you're convinced that despite Hassan claiming to be for the one-state solution, that it's impossible. You know why that is? Because Hassan himself doesn't work to make something like that more possible, because he does shit like this, normalization.
This, okay? Because this is a very important question for people on the left. Do you want retribution? Do you want vengeance? Do you want revenge?
This is someone framing...
Or do you want justice?
This is someone framing, to be clear, what is actually restorative justice, in Palestinians having what was taken from them restored, framing that as revenge. This is the slaves rebelling against their masters, thus they cannot be freed rhetoric. Anyone who is remotely pro-Palestine or in general, supposedly on the left, would never say something like this.
Yeah, the idea that settler colonialism, including its more moderate and liberal apologetic forms, will whitewash the argument of maintaining the status quo by saying we can't ask for revenge. We can do a two-state solution, which is to say the settler colony gets to continue existing, and then it'll be a two-state kind of thing, ignoring the historical material reality, as settler colonies will renege on those promises. Like, it's instead of land back and reparations, which is what you should be pushing for, they will instead make arguments that keep things the same, which is the centrist neoliberal approach. So Bad Empanada is absolutely right about that.
Never, ever. And he begins like this. I guess the polycule has an Israeli in it, and they didn't like what they saw.
Do you want to be right, or do you want justice?
Do you see the framing here? The framing is that actual justice is impossible. Hence, if you are aiming for actual justice and attempting to move the needle towards it, you are like living in a fantasy world. Now, surprisingly, these sorts of people would never apply this.
Yeah, the fantasy being that that kind of thing is very much a situation where the fantasy for them is they think that the two-state solution won't lead to more genocide. But the reality is that settler colonies have a lifespan that only lasts for so long, and they're built to expand. So they're ignoring the reality that, you know, if you have a cancer, a tumor, it's just going to grow, because that's how settler colonies work. They grow until they're unsustainable. They get as much profit for the state as they can, and then they fall apart. That's how fascism works. So Bad Empanada is absolutely right about that.
This sort of logic to their own country.
Yep. They'll ignore fascism at home because they're also running interference for, newsflash, America, the country, the state, is also a settler colony, and it has a lifespan. And insofar as it can maintain itself as, you know, a capitalist country, and imperialism comes home to empire, it starts to die, and then suddenly there's a double standard. And that double standard, either liberals will apologize for that, or in certain cases they'll push back against fascism at home, but not overseas. So Bad Empanada is right about that as well.
They have no problem talking about how bad and evil conservatives are. They have no problem talking about how ridiculous that strategy of like working within the Democratic Party, how ridiculous that do nothing sort of thing in the USA is.
Okay. I got all that figured out, so let's keep at it.
They have no problem telling you that like Trump is a fascist and calling for illegal things to be done against him and people who support him. But when it comes to Israelis, when it comes to Israeli soldiers, suddenly any sort of action for actual justice in Palestine that wouldn't necessarily, obviously, need to come at the cost of Israelis because the Israelis themselves took what they have from the Palestinians. Any sort of speech.
So there's basically a performative element to this particular group of liberals where they will talk the talk, but when it comes time to do something against settler colonialism, which is to say the United States' last foothold in the region because it's losing its hold on the world at large, and Israel's like basically its lifeline into that part of the world, and they're siphoning everything that they can through that, and these individuals will talk the talk through all of the language that Bad Empanada has discussed, rattled off, but then when it comes to threatening the last bastion of American imperialism, they can't have that. And specifically what he calls liberal, polycool liberals or ANCOM liberals, which is, I really take offense to that because ANCOM people and or poly people are not the same thing as liberals. So you should just call it liberal, period. And if you want to highlight that, some liberals will adopt some of these other tactics to blend in, then that's fine. But he's not really doing that, at least not nearly enough. And it kind of pisses me off.
Each on that level gets them talking like this. You just want revenge. You don't want justice. It's the exact opposite. You don't want justice. You're specifically against justice. What you want is like a sign off on an equal rights bill and nothing more being done. The Palestinian problem is not one of equal rights. The Palestinian problem is one of this entire system of racism and supposed apartheid exists to legitimize and maintain the fundamental core of the problem, which
I would disagree insofar as those aren't mutually exclusive concepts. Like, if you fight for equal rights at home and abroad, then it ties into these systems of oppression that you're talking about. Like, equal rights is absolutely a problem because Palestinians are treated like they don't have equal rights. So you don't want to just fall back onto the dialogue of equal rights and treat that as a talking point that only applies to people domestically, and that there's this weird omalist double standard with Palestinians. But equal rights are actually pretty important. That's what we're fighting for, not just at home, but all around the world. Universal equal rights for all.
which is land theft, economic theft.
Yeah, we're arguing for land back, which is a form of equal rights. The right to have one's sovereignty, ownership over the land restored.
Material deprivation taken from one group and given to another. So yes, you need to take that back. You need to take from the Israelis. It's going to have to happen.
Yes.
And if you argue against that and you frame that like this guy is framing it as pure like revenge, vengeance, and not actual justice,
It's the very the Merchant of Venice argument where Shylock says to the Christians of Venice, "If you wrong us, shall we not revenge?" That idea of Jewish revenge also applies to any group that has been wronged, not just Jewish people from the medieval period onwards, but any group that has been wronged, has been chattelized, has been colonized. You know, the revenge, the fear of revenge from the colonized is something that gets evoked in popular media all the time. For instance, the zombie apocalypse, which didn't just apply to people of color during the civil rights movement, because, you know, Night of the Living Dead came out in 1968, and rather it was something that also was made in regards to that kind of moral panic was Red Scare, Lavender Panic, and the fear of various uprisings, and not just African Americans, but also anti-war movements, fear of hippies, and similar, the free love movement. So there are a lot of different things, and oftentimes they were divided and not working together, but that divide and conquer strategy would alienate these different groups, but also sort of fetishize them and present them as these vengeful killer hippies, like Charles Manson, for instance, or The Last House on the Left, and then obviously Night of the Living Dead, and similar stories that would demonize queer people, demonize people of color, demonize people who are against the rights of the Palestinians, because in 1968 or thereabouts you had the Nakba, and war is holy for liberals insofar as money that keeps flowing up into the elite, the bourgeoisie at home, they visualize this fantasy where the trickle down is somehow equal, and it's not. It's virtually non-existent.
My friend, you might as well go to Israel and ask for citizenship. You'd do really well there.
Yep. Yeah, I would agree.
Because you are absolutely supporting their goals and their aims.
Like, these are important fucking questions. Actually,
they're not. They're not. You're just asking questions in a way that sort of pushes a particular talking point. You're framing it as a question, but it's just like the Socratic method that's concealing a very harmful ideology, which is American liberalism, which does nothing but further and apologize for genocide.
Actually, and to me, it's who I hold in solidarity. Like, this determines who I hold in solidarity.
I hold this IDF soldier in solidarity. I stand in solidarity with him. What the fuck does that mean?
It takes the language of solidarity and is basically saying that not all cops are bad because IDF soldiers are cops. And this extends, they might make exceptions in terms of they might critique the police abuse at home, for instance, but they draw the line at the police abroad because that would affect the bottom line. So you have to be against all police in order for you to be against genocide, because in order for genocide to work, there has to be a certain military or paramilitary police agency at work officially and stochastically to achieve profit, which is just the structure of capital achieving genocide pursuant to the profit motive. So, saying that you stand in solidarity with IDF soldiers is stupid because they're cops, which means that, okay, you're standing in solidarity with the state and states' rights, which is about slavery. If we go back to, say, the Civil War, for instance, it's just obscurantism.
What does it mean to stand in solidarity with an IDF soldier just because he said that the occupation is bad and the Gaza genocide is bad? What is the effect of doing that, of elevating this guy? Why can't this guy just be another guy who's there? Why does he need to be specifically elevated? And
yeah, Bad Empanada is right about that too, insofar as, IDF soldiers are often treated like paragons. If you're a member of the IDF, you belong to the most moral army in the world, very similar to the United States during the Vietnam War, or any conflict really, where, at least in the eyes of liberals, their own soldiers could do no wrong. And even though Israel is a settler colony in the Middle East, it is still an extension of the United States and is given a air of American exceptionalism because America is funding all of this. Therefore, it's the tip of the spear. And in order for American exceptionalists under Pax Americana to basically sleep at night, they have to think of themselves as just, not genocidal maniacs. There's a huge amount of cognitive dissonance. And that could be intentional, or it could also just be that these people don't care. And insofar, to say that they just literally don't care at all, if they didn't care at all, then why bother with the masks? They're not just lying to others, they're also self-deceiving. They're lying to themselves to make their lie to other people more believable. Doesn't mean that they're not liars, because liberals are, but they also sort of are high in their own supply. They drink the Kool-Aid and they think that they really are fighting for a better world. Whether or not intent doesn't matter, though. Bad Empanada is right about that. Consequences are. The outcome of this will be nothing short of genocide. So they need to be challenged and exposed every step of the way.
and have him presented as like an example of how the Israelis can be our allies. Hence, the logic that follows that, if we don't actually need to fight against them, this is not a zero-sum game. It is, by the way.
It is, yes. Insofar as challenging capital, challenging genocide, either they win or we win. And I will argue that, it's an uphill battle. It's you want to have hard stances like Bad Empanada. Absolutely, I agree 100%. It is a zero-sum game. But also, there is a non-zero-sum game insofar as, we're going to have victories and they're going to have victories. It isn't just like, there are going to be different parts of the world that are fighting against fascism more successfully and at the nation state level, but also at the ground level, the grassroots level. So it's like there's multiple instances of the same game going on at the same time. It's not like everything is just homogenous because, we're divided by land, air, and sea, and we're also divided by, political ideologies. Depending on what country you're in, the cause is going to take different forms, for instance. But insofar as just standing against genocide, absolutely, that's a hard, fast rule. You have to be against genocide. All cops are bad, all states are bad, all genocides are bad. It kind of goes without saying, but it's these people like Mustache Guy here will make arguments that are like, well, this genocide's okay, because that's what they're doing with the state of Israel.
We need an alliance here between the slayer and the slain. That's what we need.
Yes. So he's saying that about what this guy's saying. And no, you don't want to debate Nazis. Basically, that's a terrible idea. You don't want to debate liberals for that instance. You can debate people, once you get to a certain point on the left, but then if those people on the left are demonstrably not on the left because they're debating Nazis, then they're not really on the left, now are they?
Which obviously could only ever result in mass concessions to the slayer. We're not talking about pure emotion here. We're not talking about morality.
I'd also say real quick that making concessions with various party politics that are aligned with the state, because the state will make concessions and the state will still sacrifice people. So as an actual ANCOM, critiquing the Soviet Union, critiquing, communist China, and critiquing various nation states throughout the world that will oftentimes make concessions and throw certain things under the bus, often queer people, often the environment, and various, minority groups that are treated differently. The state as a whole needs to be challenged, but I will argue that if there's a particular aspect of the state that is more aggressively dangerous insofar as the United States, and setting people on fire, dropping bombs on them, they should be challenged first. There is an order of operations. We can critique China, we can critique Russia, or just any nation state, period. Cuba, for that matter. Like, these aren't utopias. They're not communist countries because they haven't achieved communism yet. And by and large, I would argue that they're all state capitalist in nature. And if you want to get down with a magnifying glass and look at all of them and think about it more, deeply than that, then that's fine. But they're not above criticism, but they don't merit as much criticism as, say, the United States does. So I agree with Bad Empanada about that too.
Talking about material justice, we're talking about reality. We want to move towards something better than like a fucking American mediated two-state solution. And you, in your own little way, prevent that by standing in solidarity with some IDF veteran. Does that mean that like some random ass fucking IDF veteran shouldn't participate in a strike or whatever? No. However, that's not what's happening here. He's literally filming a fucking video and being posted on like the union account, and this guy's like sharing it and talking about how important it is. When you do that, you lead people towards Zionism.
Well, yeah, because you're lionizing a cop. As far as communism goes, it's no gods, no masters, no kings, and including their servants. No traitors. No class traders, no race traders, no cultural traders. These are all modular elements, but they intersect. Class war is race war, because that's how capital works at this point. And then the cultural elements, same idea. Anything can tokenize. And so Bad Empanada is right about that too. It's like you don't want to put cops on a pedestal. If you have, all cops are bad. So if they're an ex-cop, an ex-IDF soldier, for instance, and they're not for the cause anymore. I mean, you saw that in Vietnam, right? A lot of people come home from the war disillusioned. And if they're actively challenging the cause after, having served and realizing the error of their ways, then yeah, okay, they should be allowed to participate, but they shouldn't be lionized the way that this person is doing it, because if you worship someone, you treat them as a god and they can do no wrong. They become a leader to follow. The cause becomes something to follow. Their cause, the state's cause, what they're betraying their fellow workers, animals, the environment, and nature for.
This person, this guy, stood with us at the encampment.
Wow. Amazing. And?
He was an IDF soldier. I don't care. I don't care that he was an IDF soldier.
You don't?
That's weird. It'd be like if he was a Nazi. All he had to do was stand next to you. Like, that's it. And then what if he goes home and then commits genocide again? It's like, no, this is basically debating Nazis. If someone was an ex-Nazi and, they're like healing from hate, the documentary 2021, I think, maybe a little bit earlier than that, where they talk about people who used to be basically a part of, neo-Nazi gangs, and they would escape from those and speak out against them very actively. That's one thing. But if you have someone who's just like an IDF soldier who went to a protest, you can't protest and then go home to your office job, which is in direct opposition to the protest. That just means that you're two-faced.
Don't care that he massacred babies? You don't care that he killed people? Okay.
If he is doing what he can at this moment, using his platform, using whatever power he has to stand against the occupation.
What he's doing here is presenting himself as an authority. So we look at this guy. What is the result, as I said, of having an IDF soldier being like, hello, I am an IDF soldier and I give my stamp of approval to this encampment or whatever. I am an IDF soldier. My overall views are that Israel should withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza, and there should be a two-state solution where we get a Jewish ethno-state, no material restitution whatsoever. You see that, and you are like, okay, this guy is my friend, he's my comrade, I stand in solidarity with him. What is the effect of that? Congratulations, you just normalized Israel. Even if he was an actual anti-Zionist, you're still normalizing fucking Israel because you're presenting an IDF soldier not as someone to be fought, but as like a potential target.
Well, I mean, if you had someone who was an ex-IDF soldier and who left his country, I don't know the context behind this specific instance. If this guy was just an IDF soldier and he's part of a two-state solution, that's bad. Like, yeah, absolutely. It's like a two-state solution isn't for actually ending the genocide. It's for creating national sort of borders and boundaries where you have us versus them, and you're maintaining that structure. And if you had, an IDF soldier, like an ex-IDF soldier, like the only way for rebellion to work is, ideally, there are going to be some people that come over from one side to the other. How do you think espionage works, for instance? And it would be unrealistic to expect that, well, once a Nazi, always a Nazi, right? Well, you have some people that are obviously, come from like an original position that they changed and they've worked very hard. In this case, I would argue that the IDF soldier is doing very little. He just went to like a little protest or something, and it's like, but it doesn't even say if he's an ex-IDF soldier. But there is something to be said about people that once were soldiers that took on a position of class war against the state. That is possible. There has to be some flexibility there. But insofar as if they're still actively soldiering for the IDF and fighting for a position that isn't a one-state solution, which is to land back, then that's not demonstrably doing anything. And, if you have someone who was ex-IDF who talks about being in the IDF in a strictly negative sense, I think that's perfectly valid. But that kind of context isn't being supplied here. I don't want to say what's being said or what's not being said. But they just keep referring to this person as an IDF soldier, which implies that they're still a part of the organization.
For like singing Kumbaya to and reading poems to and having him magically be reformed. What you're doing is de-radicalizing people, if anything, moving them towards actions that will not result in anything but a Zionist solution. You guys do not do anything but frame this in like this moralistic, individualistic, like standpoint epistemology way. about who deserves to speak, who deserves our solidarity, who's doing the right thing or whatever. It's not fucking about that at all. It's like,
well, I mean, again, though, the idea of the appearance of being correct does play a role in things insofar as we want to be transparent about what is the appropriate action. You know, because even Bad Empanada, I think, would agree with me when I say that the material equality, the socio-material equality of all peoples around the world moving away from capital is a good thing. You know, it's something desirable according to that rubric. And, you know, you're not just going to frame that in dry language. You know, you're going to at least conversationally say that it's a good thing to achieve parity, to achieve equality in terms of socio-material conditions. So to say that it's not about morals at all, I think, is throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because there is a moral component. It's just not the end-all be-all, which liberals tend to focus on. They'll moralize things, but they'll throw out the material critique. And Bad Empanada is throwing out the moral component, or just the social component more broadly. And it's like, no, if you want to communicate with people, you're going to have to use more than just dialectical materialism. You know, there has to be a social component. There has to be a moral component, because people respond to moral arguments, whether or not it's convenient, you know, and you can hybridize it. You don't just have to speak exclusively in moral language like liberals do. You can combine things. My point is that a holistic, synthesized approach of various things like morality, arguments, and material critiques is entirely possible. In fact, it's necessary.
like all the is de-radicalizing people, if anything, moving them towards actions that will not result in anything but a Zionist solution. You guys do not do anything but frame this in like this moralistic, individualistic, like standpoint epistemology way about who deserves to speak, who deserves our solidarity, who's doing the right thing or whatever. It's not fucking about that at all. It's like all the fucking obnoxious Owen Jones fans who comment on my video, like, come on, his heart is in the right place. Doesn't matter if his heart is in the right place. What matters is the effect of what he does. You're not going to reform stuff.
I would agree that, you know, it's the idea of there being a demonstrable liberal component in terms of what someone says and how you can, you know, demonstrably prove that what they're doing does more harm than good, which liberalism does. But also, you know, soc dems, for instance, are still reliant on state theatrics and imperialism. You know, it's so, you know, the base and the superstructure, the way that it was conceived from Marx onwards in terms of capital, is something that soc dems rely on. It's still a predatory system, and its arguments, like the problem with Hassan Piker, for instance, is that he doesn't challenge it nearly enough. He needs to be more radical than he is. But even with someone like Bad Empanada, where he's kind of a know-it-all, and he's punching down at certain groups and saying, oh, well, we're naive, or we don't know what we're doing. And he's also lumping us in with liberals, which is stupid. And so it's like, it's about balance in terms of what we're saying. Not in terms of a centrist argument, but in terms of incorporating different things that holistically punch up against the state, against capital, against genocide, against cops, against Israel, against America, against Marxist Leninism, for that matter.
Someone who has a ton to lose from being reformed, get this shit out of your head. Stop focusing on appealing to and like coddling the oppressor. They're not going to listen to you. They have like millions of dollars in reasons not to listen to you. You claim to be Marxist. If you're Marxist, how about you engage in some material analysis? People have...
Yeah, okay. Material analysis is fine, but, you know, it's like you do have to work within a social component. Because if you're, you know, the argument that he's saying against, you know, oh, if you're a Marxist, why don't you engage in material analysis? Well, the same reason he gave before also applies to that. If they have a material interest not to engage in these kinds of critiques, then stating the obvious to them won't work either. You know, so it's like you have to get them to see these people as human, and there is a social element involved with that, and that can happen at home. You know, Julia Kristeva calls it the process of abjection, essentially us versus them. Well, you have to reverse that in ways that humanize, you know, the people around them through monstrous language. You know, you can't just say, oh, well, it's in our material best interests, because they're going to look at that and, you know, they're going to experience Red Scare, or they're already acting in bad faith anyway, so it doesn't matter what you say to them. So it's like, in terms, if someone's acting in bad faith, you have to expose them as acting in bad faith. And then you have to make them into an object lesson, which explains why people who act in bad faith are hiding their intent, which is to make money through genocide, generally off the backs of other people who are already marginalized and being genocided by the state at home and abroad. That's the argument that I would make. It's not just, oh, well, you just need to make material critiques. I'm like, that's not going to work either. They're anti-communist. It doesn't matter what you say to them. You expose them, and then you find people that aren't grifters, and you start there.
Something to materially lose from Palestinian liberation. You should not at all cater your strategy to appealing to those people, because it's a losing fucking strategy. You're wasting your fucking time. Obviously, it's not a good strategy. You're not going to win arguing on morality to people who have a ton to lose.
You're not going to win arguing through material benefits either. Though I would say that I think Bad Empanada is saying that you appeal to someone's self-interest insofar, hey, you're a grifter, and this money that you're trying to make and this self-security that you're trying to make by supporting empire, that's going to go bye-bye because imperialism is going to come home to empire. That's, I think, what Bad Empanada is trying to say. That, I would argue, is not a bad way to go about it, but also it's not divorced from like moral components. You know, it's like you can still say, you can appeal to someone in terms of material interest, but what about their friends? You know, they have families, and you say, well, your families are going to be affected by this too. Materially, there's still an emotional critique. There's still a moral critique, because defense of family is, you know, is a moral argument to some extent, but it still can be connected to a material argument that you're using to argue out of self-interest. If you want to defend the family that's so important to you, then, you know, you want to go against the nuclear structure. You want to go against the state, because the state eventually decays and cannibalizes any family model that you would hope to defend. That's the kind of argument that I would make, Bad Empanada.
From anything resembling justice.
To fight against it, I'm in solidarity with this guy.
He's not fighting against it. He's not fighting against the same things that you supposedly are.
I'm in solidarity with this guy.
So let's get to him, like, trying to critique me.
Whenever you're like, you know, who is served by locking people into prison? I think Zionism needs to be fully eradicated as an ideology. I don't disagree with that aspect of it. I do think Zionism is a dangerous racist ideology that needs to be eradicated and, like, you know, wiped off the face of the earth. But I don't think you do that by locking people in cages. I don't think you do that by locking people in cages. I don't. I think you do that with, like, you know, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. You do that with...
South Africa. These people always bring up South Africa. What happened in South Africa? Whites kept everything. How is South Africa? Shit. It's true. South Africa fucking sucks. You don't do a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You fucking punish the perpetrators and you take what they stole. Fuck Truth and Reconciliation Commissions where everyone just gets off scot-free. The worst idea ever.
Well, yeah, I mean, and the idea that, you know, you need to hold people accountable for what they did, you know, punishing people for war crimes is a thing. Like, and you're not just punishing people, but you're making an example of them in regards to an ideology. Like, if you just give them a slap on the wrist, then they're just going to keep doing it.
It's like, this guy is nothing but a liberal who just wants to feel good. He wants to feel like he's doing something. He wants to feel like a radical, but any actual real action to achieve justice makes him too uncomfortable. Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, almost every person who committed horrible crimes during the apartheid era in South Africa was fucking given amnesty by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That's not good. That's not what we fucking want.
Equal rights.
Yeah, no, I can't really disagree with that. Like, what's the point of a tribunal and the Nuremberg trials, you know, where you execute maybe a few people at the top, but then most of the people, you know, either escape or get away, or they're given amnesty, they're given immunity by the state. You know, it's a compromise, and it's a compromise that allowed these people to not only escape and elude justice, but also infiltrate and assimilate pre-existing structures of power that were holding the tribunals to begin with. You know, so it's leading to these systems to corrupt the same way that they did before the tribunals took place.
That's all? Equal rights? That's all? Truth and Reconciliation Commission, equal rights? Dude, tomorrow, if Israel signed off on the equal rights bill and declared that there was one state,
Well, another thing I want to say is that if people like this are arguing for equal rights, they're arguing for impunity for themselves. we want equal rights so far as it protects us from the consequences of our own actions in defense of genocide. So he's like, oh, I'm against racism, I'm against this or that, but also equal rights for racist people, which is what the IDF is.
So that would not be a solution. The Israelis still have what they took from the Palestinians. The Palestinians would still be fucking dirt poor and overall oppressed because they don't have their land and homes anymore. They don't have, the fucking economic goods that were stolen from them that they actually need to uplift themselves. The problem of Israel is not a problem of rights. It's a problem of land. It's a problem of material deprivation.
The arguments regarding rights are still something you have to deal with, though. Like you're saying, oh, it's not an issue, but then you're still spending all this time talking about what this guy's saying. There's still an argument there that you have to deal with. And it is an argument about rights. It's the rights of workers and the land rights, in terms of, does the state own it or do workers own it? And which workers? The colonized versus the colonizer rights. So it is a question of rights. You can't divide them. You're doing this classic Marxist Leninist sort of faux pas where, it's like me culpa, me maxima culpa, where you're saying it has nothing to do with rights at all. And I'm like, that's stupid. Like, it's stupid, but it's like, I understand why you're saying it. Like, where state people who are pro-slavery will be like, oh, well, it's about states' rights versus, that's what the Civil War was about, for instance. And you're like, okay, well, obviously states' rights is just a dog whistle for slavery, but it's still states' rights, the states' rights to own slaves. So it is still a question of rights, states' rights versus worker rights. That's not divorced from a material critique either. It's a socio-material critique, and this goes all the way back to Marx. The superstructure and the base support and maintain each other. They don't exist in separate, like, vacuums.
It's a problem of one group of people taking things from another, taking material, really existing things.
And they do that through the argument of rights. Now, in the case of liberals, they abuse the rhetoric of rights in a liberal way to basically white knight capital and apologize for fascism and black knights and maintain the entire structure. You're right about that, but that's not the same thing as saying that rights don't matter, because land back is a question of rights. Land back for what? The right to own land. The right for workers to have the land that they previously had lived in belong to them once more. You're giving land back to indigenous peoples. You're dismantling the state, which is, a structure that sees its right to own land for the sake of the bourgeoisie, which is defended by the middle class. So, it's absolutely, rights are a part of the equation, but you can point out that this guy is using it in bad faith, but to say that it has nothing to do with anything at all, or that it's just material critiques, and material critiques somehow aren't tied to the social component of administering rights. Arbitrating land and rights is exactly what's going on here. We just have to deal with people who are doing it in bad faith.
Not them implementing racist laws. The racist laws are there to maintain the material deprivation. They are a symptom. They are a means. They aren't an end.
Well, they are something that we'll have to change, or at least contend with. If we're made illegal and our rights are taken away, we have to acknowledge that while pushing for material change. We're changing not just material conditions, but also social conditions, because we need people to realize that we're human, that we have basic human rights, and that, our homes are our homes, but also that land back is something we have to negotiate as stewards of nature. So it's not just material stuff. It's important, but it's not the only thing.
I'm drinking my blue. He's drinking his blue.
How is justice served? What is justice? Fascists deserve zero space in whatever we call the left. Giving even an inch is a betrayal to the resistance in Palestine, to the student intifada, to the militants across the global south working tirelessly to hold their governments accountable. We give no room to fascism. Okay,
Yeah, that sounds good.
I agree. I like Hyatt a lot. I want her to be successful on this platform, but I think describing and I don't even know if she's talking about Yuval here, but describing Yuval as a bloodthirsty fascist.
If he's a member of the IDF, he's a bloodthirsty fascist. It's like saying he's a good Nazi. He's a Nazi's a Nazi, because fascism is built on bloodletting. Zionism, you can't say that Zionism is bad and then say that there are certain good IDF soldiers that are a part of that project, because the project is built on bloodletting. So you can't make exceptions for that. It's an absolute, and it is an absolute. That's the whole point of a settler colonial project. So this mustache guy is basically tone policing Hayat.
Is ridiculous. It's ridiculous.
What does Yuval ultimately want? What is he ultimately working for? Have you thought about that? He's against the settlements. He's against the genocide. Great. Excellent. What does he want in the long run? Would he be okay if it was found that his land was actually owned by a Palestinian family and he had to leave? Would he be okay with that? That he's even there is ridiculous, right? Like, they've posted videos of him like screaming at Israeli soldiers. There are thousands of Palestinians who scream at Israeli soldiers every day. Why is it that when an Israeli does it, you're suddenly spotlighting it? It's suddenly special. Why? Yuval is the filmmaker of the Israeli guy who the Israeli token on Nova land. Why is it that when an Israeli does it, it's special? What is the effect of propping that up?
Yeah, no, I would agree with Bad Empanada. We need to put a focus. Like, it's okay to highlight that there are people who are radicalizing, who come from the status quo, and they push away from that, but they shouldn't be given the focus. It's the problem with a lot of like heroic narratives more broadly in Western canon. The monomyth is oftentimes the hero isn't someone who's actually marginalized, but it's like Luke Skywalker in Star Wars. And it's like, no, we need to focus on people who are more marginalized, because they're the ones who are suffering the consequences of any settler colonial project anywhere in the world.
What does that result in? Well, for one, he's a liberal Zionist. This is very clear from the fact that he went up on stage and used a supposedly Palestinian film to spread liberal Zionist talking points about the hostages, aka illegal frontier settlers, and about the crime of October 7th. He talked about how Israelis deserve national rights and how there should be national rights for both peoples. What is an Israeli? An ethno-nationalist constructed settler colonial identity. We know what that means. He wants to somehow maintain the national rights of Israelis.
Yeah, Bad Empanada is not wrong about any of that.
That he's against the West Bank occupation and the settlers there does not change that. Even if that was not true, what is the...
Well, and it doesn't change that, because it's the Omalist refrain, right? He's like, well, I want to have a two-state solution. I want to maintain Omalist as it exists, which is a settler colonial project, and there has to be someone who's getting tortured, basically, and we can't concede any of this and give it back to the people that we tortured. We're never going to give it back to the person who's locked in the basement, the person who's dispossessed, who's, locked up and being tortured by us while we posture in bad faith. So it's like, you have to walk away from Omalist, basically. And this IDF individual, the token IDF, person that appears in the film that Bad Empanada is talking about, isn't walking away from Omalist. You have to actually demonstrating good faith. And if you are kind of hedging your bets or playing both sides while still trying to posture a particular way, I mean, that's the problem with a lot of punk movements, especially when they started to decay, is it often comes from positions of privilege that would gentrify and deteriorate the entire movement. The problem with feminism is that it historically started out as like white, moderate, middle-class women, and who would fight to defend those positions. They would maintain a fight and defend their white middle-class position within a settler colony. They wouldn't try and change the settler colony. They would defend their own position within it, thus become the gatekeepers of capital. It's the same idea with these token IDF soldiers, where they're like, oh yeah, man, we're totally doing this. It's controlled opposition, which lasts about as long as the state wants it to, before, when push comes to shove, they'll fall back in line and they'll punch down. And they'll punch down while they're pretending to punch up. If you're punching down while you're punching up, you're not actually punching up. It's a bigotry for one is a bigotry for all. You have to, there are no exceptions insofar as liberation goes. If you are a cop, you are a colonizer. and there can be no exceptions when it comes to fighting colonizers, just as there can be no exceptions when it comes to fighting for the freedom or emancipation of the colonized. That is very important. We have to do that, because otherwise it's just an anomalous situation wherever you are, regardless if it's Israel or not.
The effect of like having a video where there's 10 people screaming at Israeli troops, 9 of them are Palestinians, and we focus on the Israeli. What is the effect of showing that to people? Oh, it looks like the Israelis aren't actually the enemy. It looks like the Israelis don't actually support the occupation and the genocide of Palestinians, and that.
Yes, I would agree. It's like you're whitewashing it, because it'd be like, Star Wars again, if you're finding stormtroopers and you're spending most of your time trying to find a good stormtrooper instead of, focusing on all the bad ones. Like, you might find 1 or 2 stormtroopers that have a bone to pick with their employer, or who are like double agents or something, but the vast majority of them are not. Like, so I think it's a lot more productive to focus on, commenting on all the horses running around instead of searching for the one unicorn. Because even if you find one unicorn, then you're just highlighting, like, okay, there's going to be a few people that aren't comfortable doing what they're doing to the degree that they aren't able to sleep at night, or they straight up leave the cause. But then if they leave, the state and fighting for it, then they're not, a part of the IDF anymore. So I would agree. You absolutely want to focus on the structure and the vast majority of people within it who are just acting in bad faith to begin with.
Settler colonialism, it looks like they don't actually support that, because it's within their self-interest to. And it looks like we can actually appeal to them and turn them into more Yuvals. So there's no need for us to fight them anymore.
Well, yeah, I think that's the liberal approach to things. I think you don't want to debate Nazis. You don't really even want to debate liberals, because they're just Nazis with a mask. If you can point out examples of people who basically de-assimilate and radicalize in a left-leaning direction, I think that's actually important to do, because you need to recognize that the people you're dealing with are still people. And that means that they are susceptible to mechanisms of persuasion, insofar as you can appeal to their humanity insofar as what they think is human by subverting what they think isn't human. So it's like, to just write everyone off as a Nazi, well, what do you do with all the Nazis? You just kill them all? What do you do with people who support Nazis or who debate Nazis? Do you kill them all too? So you have to find ways to convince people that you want to radicalize them without, it's like, okay, well, we're going to kill you at the end. Good job, Wesley. Kill you tomorrow. It's like you're going to have to, there has to be a diplomatic element to this to some extent. I'm not saying, you want to demask people, absolutely, but you also have to recognize that there is an element of persuasion in regards to, like, if you have people who are on the fence, if you have soldiers, there can still be like a lateral or a peripheral appeal to them. You don't want to focus on them. You want to focus on the the people who are doing the lion's share of the work. The Vietnam War, they won by dispiriting the middle class. You will kill 10 of us and we will kill 1 of you, but in the end, you will tire first, Ho Chi Minh. So it's like, but that happened through appeals to the American middle class. In that particular instance, it had as much to do with them and their own families and their own emotional appeals, but also, incidentally, anti-war movements that still played a role. They might not have been as big and impressive as we would have wanted them to be. They could have been fractured and splintered in the civil rights movement and the free love movement. They were all kind of their own thing. It was like an egg that had been punched, so the shell was kind of cracked, but it's still sort of loosely connected. So, and you want to solidarize that intersectionally while also making appeals to the enemy, because the enemy is not this dark monolith. The Nazis were not this dark monolith. The structure was, insofar, but even then, they still work through the same appeals. We want to subvert those. There's value in that.
One effect of it. Another effect of it is that the focus is changed to a focus that sympathizes with Israelis. Because now that we have this supposedly good Israeli, who is supposedly reformed and doing good things for the Palestinians.
Sorry, I keep interrupting him, but another way to look at it is that you don't want Israelis are cops. They're part of a settler colonial project. So instead of saying all cops are bad, say all Israelis are bad, because the vast majority, from a functional standpoint, belong to a system where every citizen is a cop. And there's a very small number that aren't outside the mainstream, but the mainstream Israeli opinion is that they are cops and they are policing their victims with impunity. So to say that all, you have to adopt a position, just say all cops are bad and Israelis are cops. And then if someone wants to refute that, then they can leave Israel. And if they can't leave Israel, they better have a good fucking description as to why. Maybe they're stuck. Maybe they literally can't leave. What if they were born there, and they're not like an American citizen, and they can't leave the state of Israel, and they don't have the means to travel? That could happen. But then those are exceptions, and then you'd be like, okay, well, obviously, and they're resisting, but they're also alone. They are surrounded by their peers who are all functioning as cops. So you can acknowledge that, but you don't want to use it in a way that apologizes for the state. So I would agree with Bad Empanada as far as that goes. Absolutely.
Now we move to this sort of idea where, maybe it would be wrong to do something that could inconvenience them. Maybe it would be wrong to restitute the Palestinians, which would necessarily require taking what the Israelis have taken from them. So you share this video spotlighting the Israeli. The effect of that is you push people towards liberal Zionism. That is the effect.
I would say oftentimes, yeah, absolutely. You don't want to focus. You don't want to make them the center of the story, because then you have a bunch of centrists who flock around the Luke Skywalkers of the world. They're going to see themselves in a particular character who has a relative amount of privilege while oppressing other people and go from there. And it's like, yeah, if you push people towards centrism, which is apologizing for the state and its police, regardless of where they are in the world, but especially overseas, then it is going to lead to Pax Americana, or just, liberal Zionism as an extension of Pax Americana. It's just apologizing for the state through its foreign agents, essentially, its secular colonial projects. It's no different than Vietnam when they were trying to elect different people in South Vietnam. Same idea.
Does that mean that this guy should not be doing what he's doing? To be frank, I don't really care. What he does doesn't change anything. Whether you believe it or not, having an Israeli do the same thing as Palestinians, all it is there is another voice, except he's not going to get shot. That's the only real difference.
No, I think I would argue that if you have people in positions of privilege who can walk away from being cops but still have relative privilege compared to the oppressed, like people with privilege should absolutely use their privilege to speak out for the oppressed. And what do you think Edward Said did towards the Palestinians? He was a Palestinian American citizen, but he wrote in America from a position of privilege, and he wrote Orientalism, he wrote culture and imperialism, and he wrote for the Palestinians in his entire life. People with privilege should absolutely use it, and we don't want to discount the value of that. But if they're using their privilege to maintain the state in bad faith, that's absolutely something we should criticize.
It honestly doesn't matter.
It does matter insofar as what I just said.
I'm not concerned with questions about this guy's individual worth, though he is a piece of shit for getting up on stage and trying to insert liberal Zionist bullshit. But ultimately, the fact that he's there...
Yeah, if that's what he's doing, I'm not as familiar with this particular actor. I haven't seen the film, but from what I understand, Bad Empanada is correct that this individual, if he's actually making Zionist talking points and apologetics, then we need to demask him and expose him. Absolutely, 100%. Because either someone's an ally or they're not, but there still is that theatrics taking place. We got to Scooby-Doo that shit.
He's a net negative, a massive net negative that pushes people towards liberal Zionism. The fact that this film ultimately had to water down its narrative and be far less blameful and far less diagnostic of the issue than it could otherwise have been is a travesty. I think that things would be better if this film did not exist.
Yeah, I would argue that by and large, it's like there are probably a small number of people that might watch it who are already of the opinion that, American liberalism is bad, and they could take it and basically respond the way that Bad Empanada is, which is to say they're critiquing it. But that's not a strength of the film. That's just the critic going after it and dissecting it. But you could make the same argument with Mein Kampf or any problematic piece of media. That's not to the piece of media's credit. And I think that by and large, the whole point of the film is to whitewash genocide, by the sounds of it. Haven't seen it yet, but just, if they have to basically take away Palestinian voices to lionize or whitewash IDF voices, that's a problem. And that does, the only thing that ultimately is accomplishing in terms of like in a canonical sense is look at this piece of media. It's, people might watch 12 Years a Slave or a similar film that would seem to be anti-slavery, but then it focuses on, a very particular aspect of it in a way that is like, I don't mean to use just that random film off the top of my head, where liberals can watch a film where they can feel morally superior and make these kinds of arguments. It doesn't have to be 12 Years a Slave. It could just be any film with some degree of atrocity. And in 12 Years a Slave, the slave is, a person of color who is kidnapped from the American North and taken to the South, the American South, and, eventually was released from bondage. And it's the same idea as, Frederick Douglass, that kind of character. And that kind of thing happened, and we should absolutely listen to them. But in the case of Frederick Douglass, or this character in 12 Years a Slave, they were actually the colonized. They weren't cops. Whereas in the case of this film that Bad Empanada is talking about, that individual is a cop, and so imagine 12 Years a Slave, but imagine if he was, a house slave, and he was turning other slaves in, so like Django Unchained, that kind of thing. But then he stopped doing that. It would completely change the dynamic of that film. So that's something to keep in mind as well.
Because ultimately what this film is taken as, regardless, is the intent of the Palestinians involved in its production, is little more than a collaboration between Israelis and Palestinians, and as an example of how there is an intertwined future of these two peoples. And as you've all said on stage, all that needs to be done is sign the Bill of Equal Rights. Everything is fixed.
Yeah, it's effectively a two-state solution, which is bad because it maintains the existence of Israel, which sooner or later is just, even let's say they had a two-state solution, they might just stop one day and everything's fine, but eventually it's going to decay because it's capital. It's an extension of capital, which decays by design. And furthermore, Israel has been handed a gun and basically told in no uncertain terms to conduct genocide. So it's not like a two-state solution is just like a ceasefire or an attempt at a ceasefire. It's no different than like in Vietnam's case, they had this dividing line and then it fell apart and America lost the war and the colony collapsed. Whereas in Korea, you have North Korea and South Korea, a similar dividing line. It's the same idea, where they're just keeping the colonized and communist and various other marginalized elements, Arab people, at bay. That's all it is. It's the wall from Game of Thrones. It's us versus them. It's not doing away with that in the objection process per capital, and it's maintaining the us versus them thing. There's a border. It has to be policed. We have to stay vigilant. And wouldn't you know it, one day the levee broke, and now we're going to take preemptive revenge, and we're going to cage these people because we saw it coming. It's that Lord of the Rings kind of problem.
This is wrong. This is liberal Zionist propaganda, whether it is meant to be or not. It is creating this sort of feel-good idea that Israelis and Palestinians can work together for Palestinian liberation, which influences what people actually perceive Palestinian liberation to be, to the point where it's not actually Palestinian liberation at all.
Yeah, it makes it less radical. It whitewashes it. People need to come out swinging with this kind of stuff. So it's by and large, I do agree with everything that Bad Empanada is saying, insofar as these kinds of concessions are dangerous because if someone is no longer a member of a particular institution and they're blowing the whistle, that's one thing. But you can't have someone who's still of the institution and you're shaking hands with them, because then you're just arguing for a two-state solution. Would you do that with the Nazis and the Poles? Or, Lebensraum? It's like, because then they're just going to keep moving the goalposts as time goes on. You need to push them back. You need to push the colonizer out. It needs to be land back instantly and immediately. And there's no concession that you can make with empire. It's Lando Calrissian and Darth Vader. This deal keeps getting worse all the time. They absolutely will.
Because this is simply not true. This is feel-good liberal bullshit where you imagine the oppressor and the oppressed coming together and like putting flowers in the soldiers' rifles and then they kiss. It is not going to happen. Israelis support Zionism. Zionists elsewhere, people, Jews who aren't even Israelis, support Zionism.
Yeah, that's true. Absolutely. And, in regards to putting flowers in the gun barrels of soldiers, it's like there is a naivete to the free love movement that he's referring to. Like, and, there needs to be an element, it needs to be pragmatic and solidarized. And we can't treat the enemy who wants to kill us when they have their knives out and they have their guns pointed at us like friends, because then we're just lining up in front of them to be shot. It's like we need to recognize who the enemy is, who the threat is. Bad Empanada is absolutely 100% right about that.
Because they fundamentally recognize Israel as beneficial to them materially. You can talk about it, but it corrupts the soul or whatever. That doesn't fucking matter. What matters is the fucking reality. These people see a country where they can move to and get a free house whenever they want, get subsidized by the government to live in that house, in fact. They're given special privileges and like they get to live in like an exclusive, epic, awesome community specifically for people like them. And they're like, sign me up. And Israelis, born into it or not.
Yeah, you have to keep in mind that like a settler colonial project is a project where you're dealing with people who make a conscious, informed choice. And then what do you do with people who are Israeli by accident of birth? There are children who are born into the situation. They're victims of the state propaganda. That is something that we have to acknowledge. I'm not saying we have to apologize for it, but, what do you do if you have a 10-year-old Israeli citizen, or someone who's like 5 years old, someone who's, as Aristotle said, give me a boy until he is 7 and I will show you the man. What do you do when you're dealing with people who are younger like that? And is it worth trying to talk to? Obviously, individuals like that don't belong to the IDF. They're not cops yet, but they're being groomed to becoming cops. So I think it is important to reach out to people who, by no fault of their own, through accident of birth, are born and bred inside Israel. I think there is something to be said about, speaking out against genocide to people like that. And, trying to, I'm not saying you have to make it your sole focus, but, it's like the enemy isn't just adult soldiers with guns. There's also children involved. Women, children, old people, and, various victims of settler colonialism. I'm not saying we have to apologize for them either because, sooner or later, whether they want to or not, they become a part of that specific project. They're literally born into it. But it is something worth mentioning, because what are we going to do? Kill them too? Like killing women and children? Like, where do we draw the line with that kind of thing? How do you arbitrate that? So there has to be a means to giving fascists you can leave the door open for them. I'm not saying that you're constantly standing there waiting for them to walk through and letting them basically the Greeks in through the Trojan horse. I'm not saying you have to do that, but you also have to let them, there has to be some kind of acknowledgement that yes, it is possible for a life after fascism. Because a lot of times they're recruited from broken homes. They're recruited in a settler colony, which what's more of a broken home than that? So I think it's worth entertaining that. But, veering away from like these feel-good liberal sort of, what would you call it? Like, a lightning rod for liberal and neoliberal sort of talking points where it's very didactic in that sense, like these various films where they're like, see, look, we can be friends. You can recognize that some things like two-state apologia and Zionist apologia ultimately, but you can still be like, look, if you guys pull your heads out of your asses, here's where you can find us, basically, or here's where you can reach out. It is, you don't want to leave people feeling like they're stuck in these colonies because I feel like Bad Empanada is almost just like, look, hey, you can, they're doomed. They're a lost cause, and it's one thing if they're a cop, if they're a war criminal, but what if they just live in the colony, and they're subjected to all of this? Have you ever been in a broken home? Like, if battered housewives who are constantly being raped, beaten, children who are constantly being raped, beaten? I was both of those things, so you have to acknowledge that you are, if you're born into a settler colony, you're a victim up to a point, and then victims will either become victimized further by the state, or they'll become cops themselves. So it's not, you can't just look at Zionism and say, well, they're just all pirates and they're all evil. And it's like, no, there is a little bit more nuance in that. But I agree that we want to avoid having like these liberal concessions that basically make a single movie and then say, well, we solved Zionism. It's like, no, you do have to do demonstrable things, but making appeals to the enemy to try and convince more victimized elements of them is not a wasted strategy if you know what you're doing. I'm not saying you have to devote all of your energy towards doing it, but if we don't do it at all, then they're just going to fight to the death. They'll fight for what they perceive as home against what they perceive as the ultimate foe. So we have to present ourselves as human to some extent by offering them something that they would never give to us. If you say, show them no mercy, for you shall receive none, are you any better than them? And I'm not saying that you can't kill the enemy. You absolutely can. But if there are opportunities where you give the enemy an ability to leave an institution where they're being held to some degree against their will, then that's something that we should do. I think that that's important. That's not what this guy's doing. That's not what the movie that he's talking about is doing. But, it's just something that I wanted to give Bad Empanada's argument a little bit more nuance because he's kind of black and white sometimes.
They get immense material privileges because of Israel. You don't fight that by appealing to their humanity and their morality. It's a losing battle. This is why, even in the few cases when there are Israelis who pertain to be advocating on behalf of Palestinians, they don't join the Palestinians. They don't join the Palestinian groups. You ever seen an Israeli in the Al-Aqsa Marches brigades? I haven't. Do you know why? Because ultimately they don't aim for the same thing. Their interests are not aligned with the Palestinians.
Yeah, so Bad Empanada is saying that it's not possible. It's literally impossible. And if that's the case, then, well, it's just, what do? These people feel like they're on an island. It's fortress mentality. And if it's not possible for them to switch sides at all, then they won't. It's actually, it de-incentivizes them to do that. Now, I'm not saying that we should, again, let them in through a Trojan horse, but to just say that it's completely impossible, I think, is a mistake. We shouldn't focus on the cherry-picked examples where it's literally liberal propaganda. We shouldn't focus on that. But again, to deny it entirely and to say that it's impossible, I think, is a mistake. Because otherwise, it's like Oscar Schindler and Schindler's List. It's rare, but it does happen. And we don't want to say, oh, well, to save one life is to save the world entire. No, we want to focus on saving all workers of the world, not just one or two, and then pat ourselves on the back. There's something to be said about, Jewish liberalism in media through Spielberg. His movies are incredibly problematic because he just focuses on Jewish people as the victims of the Holocaust. You see any gay people in those movies? You see any people of color? No, they're just all, Western Jews first and foremost. So there's something to be said about that too, absolutely.
They do not want what the Palestinians want. They don't want Palestinian return. They don't want any sort of solution that could result in an inconvenience to the Israelis. Aside from maybe the settlers in the West Bank, they might be okay with that. They might want a two-state solution. They might even want like a so-called binational state with equal rights for everyone. But they do not want material justice. They don't want restitution. They don't want restoration.
Or land back. I mean, that's basically what he's talking about. But land back is a nice, succinct way of putting it. Because land back is antithetical to state aims, because you're literally taking land away from the bourgeoisie and its middle-class defenders.
That's why the Israelis form their own groups rather than joining Palestinian ones, because fundamentally they don't have shared interests. Yes. They're not advocating for the same thing in the end.
Yes, I would agree. By and large, that's true. I think Bad Empanada and Noah Sampson in his video that we talked about earlier mentions that, there's virtually no Israelis that are against the settler colonial project. There's like 500 of them, according to their own testimony. So that's something to keep in mind. Bad Empanada can make these arguments to some extent because it's so homogenized within mainstream Israeli culture. And you have to wonder, it's like, okay, is there really just 500? Probably, in that case, it's like, well, it's dangerous to speak out against the state in Nazi Germany. It's like it's a very small number. So you're appealing to a very small number of people. But at the same time, you have to take into consideration that sometimes people are in positions where, if there's millions of cops, it's like some of those people, there has to be a little bit of give and take, just because otherwise you're saying that they're all powerful, that they're all, just they all believe in the same thing. And I would agree in Israel, they tend to toe the line, quite homogeneously, but that doesn't mean that there aren't cracks that can form. And I'm not saying that we pat them on the back if, people begin to sort of splinter or run away from the state, but at the same time, it should be acknowledged that it's theoretically at least possible.
They might be advocating for the same thing on like an individual issue level. Like they might equally be against, like, say, a specific Israeli settlement or something, but their fundamental goals are not aligned. At best, they can be temporary allies of convenience. And even
that sounds about right.
Even if they can be temporary allies of convenience, focusing on them and being like, look at what this Israeli group has to say, can only lead people towards their goals and their aims.
Yeah, because if they're allies of convenience, then they're allies in bad faith. And if they're allies in bad faith, then they're going to, on paper, be wearing the mask of friendship. But behind that mask, they're serving the state as always, which means that they're going to try and say things in such a way that they appear as friend, but they're functioning as enemy.
Towards liberal Zionism in the end, even if these are groups, and to be clear, there aren't any groups that are actually for a real one-state solution with real restoration and restitution, but even if there was such a group hypothetically, to focus specifically on them would, as I said earlier, just lead people into believing that, oh, hey, look, Israelis can be reformed, hence we don't actually need to fight Israel. What we need...
Well, again, though, it's like reformation is, I think, like, revolution and armed resistance and just fighting against the state should be first and foremost amongst our list of objectives. But it's like, again, there are going to be certain people that are just within a country and they can't leave, and generally speaking, they're going to be like women and children. Are they just collateral damage? Do you just write them off at that point? So that's just something that I'm legitimately curious about, and I would like to know Bad Empanada's thoughts.
What we need to do is like reason with them and bring them over with our moral arguments about how what they're doing is wrong. You are never going to convince someone in like maybe in like 1 out of 10,000 cases where you do find someone who's like a moralistic hipster. Outside of those cases, you're not going to convince someone to go against their fundamental interests to the point that like some of them are going to have to literally give up their land in any sort of real Palestinian liberation solution. You're never going to convince them of that. Some of them might be okay with it, like 2 of them, but when that's what is needed for actual...
I'm actually kind of curious, too. If you have a family, if you have someone that was born within the settler colony, where do they go after liberation? You're saying that they give up their land. So the adults could leave. Would the children go home? Would the children go to America with their parents who came from America? Well, then they would be leaving their home. So what do we do in that case? And ultimately, I'm for land back, but I would argue that giving certain people like of a certain age, like if you haven't served in the IDF yet, for instance, giving them the option to stay in Palestine, I don't think that that's beyond the pale. It's at least something that could be discussed. What if they didn't want to leave, and you're telling them to go to America? Well, that's not their home, and they live. And I would argue that ultimately I would rather have the Palestinians get their land back and their homes back, and that, okay, well, the kids can just go to America. They can just move. I mean, that's what military families do. So get the fuck out. And I would rather have that happen than all of them just be rounded up and, just shoved, like the idea is like with land back, okay, they should have somewhere that they should be able to go. And I don't want to, talk about this for too much longer, but just like the idea of these kinds of realities need to be acknowledged. It's like, okay, if we're talking about someone's material interests, you're not just talking to the adults in the room, you're also talking to women and children. And a one-state solution ultimately means that the colonists are going to have to leave, and that includes people whose only home that they've ever known is Israel. So what do we do about that? And that's not something I ever really hear talked about, not even by someone, like Bad Empanada, really. And I'd be genuinely curious to know what he thinks.
Justice, when that's what's needed to achieve our actual goals, then you're going to have to fight against most of those people to achieve them. And by fight, I don't mean like, commit the terrorist attacks against them or whatever. Ultimately, this is such a great situation overall to achieve this, because Israel is a small, weak country, totally reliant on foreign aid. There is really, in reality, no need to defeat Israel militarily. You defeat it economically, easily. But we're never going to do that when we have people in the countries that support Israel the most, the people who could potentially, eventually work towards taking the coercive economic action against the Israelis that could feasibly result in them being forced into giving up the stuff that they need to give up for there to be justice. When you are in those countries and you're specifically advocating against that sort of thing, against what we need to do to get to that point, which is to convince people that the only way forward is that. It's not reasoned argument. It's not appealing to the Israeli sensibilities. It is coercion. By propping up Israelis, by presenting Israeli voices as special, something that we need to pay special attention to, you propagate the idea that we can get there without any of that action. You spread, whether you mean to or not, this notion that we can just have a nice little debate with the Israelis and sing songs to them and bring them over to our side. You might.
Yeah, okay, so he's just kind of reiterating things here at the end.
Might be able to do it with like two of them. You're not going to be able to do it with most of them. And that's all that matters. We're talking about overarching strategy.
Okay, but what's the strategy again? I don't think he's really talked about that. Like, okay, like I said earlier, all right, if you want to appeal to their self-interest, but through like a material argument, but how do you convince someone to go against their own material interests? How do you convince someone to stop being a class traitor, for instance? Bad Empanada hasn't really talked about that. He's like, you need to do this, but he's not actually giving the solution. Like, okay, well, how?
Not individualistic, like moralistic things of like changing one individual's mind, which might be possible, but that's not what you need to do. Ultimately, what you should be doing if you want to be an effective advocate for actual justice in Palestine, and you're in like the USA or one of these other countries that gives Israel the economic support and the economic everything that it needs to even exist in the first place.
Okay, so this is not what we're supposed to do.
Is that you say what I'm saying here. You put it into people's heads that Israelis are how they are. Israelis do what they do ultimately because it benefits them. And thus the only way forward is coercion of
they're cops. All cops are bad.
Some form. It's going to happen against their will, not with them as willing partners. If you are against that,
yeah, I would agree. It's a kicking and screaming kind of situation. The United States didn't leave Vietnam because it wanted to.
Solution, and you're against taking the necessary action to get that solution, you are a liberal Zionist. Whether you say that you're for a one-state solution or not, you are a liberal Zionist.
Yeah, if you're not willing to oppose the state of Israel and those who defend it in a way that affects it materially, then I would agree. Yeah, absolutely. Now, the exact methodology for how you go about that can vary quite a bit. I would go on to add, but focusing on material change is not a bad thing, but there's going to be a social element to that. Just not the one that the guy that he's critiquing is doing. Another thing I wanted to say is that he didn't talk about Hassan Piker at all. Like I was gonna like watch this and I'm like, okay, he's gonna talk about Hassan Piker, and like he doesn't. Like he just mentions him at the very start, I think, and that's it. And then he's talking about this other dude whose name I don't even remember at this point. He's not even in the title of the video. It's very, very confusing.
Because ultimately what you get otherwise is liberal Zionism. I didn't see any reason to keep...
Is that what Hassan Piker does? Because otherwise, why did you mention Hassan Piker?
Keep watching this guy's video. It's just going to be bumblefuck standpoint epistemology crap. He's going to be calling me anti-Semitic. I'm sure he already has done that numerous times. It's just going to be, I stand in solidarity with all of our allies, and I am happy. And I am happy to platform any voice who can show that Israel really does not represent the Jewish people, and that the pro-Palestinian movement is not anti-Semitic, unlike this anti-Semitic guy, Bad Empanada, as if any of that fucking matters. There's no reason to even listen to Polycule Liberal, number 8,000 million, predictably consuming blue substance previously unknown to science.
Huh. Yeah, okay, so going after liberals and stuff like that, there's a lot of things that Bad Empanada said that I agree with. I think, again, he's a bit rigid and a bit of a tankie Marxist Leninist. And there's, I've said a lot about him in this video and elsewhere. I've written about him quite a bit. Not on YouTube, mostly just because most of my writing I can't share on YouTube for various reasons. But yeah, but he's absolutely right. We have to challenge the state of Israel in ways that go against the material interests of the colonizer. Absolutely 100% agree with that. There's a lot of things that we've talked about in regards to Bad Empanada, insofar as it's just a material critique. There's a social element. We can focus on that too. He's right about the state of Israel and that we can challenge them, not militarily, so we can challenge the material effect of things at home. We can lead to sanctions against the state of Israel through various political action, through some shape or form, and that's a topic for another video, obviously. But if we can lead to material change that affects people who, by and large, aren't going to listen to us, he's right insofar as the vast majority of Israeli citizens aren't going to listen to us. But I would add that there are some bystanders involved, like children in particular, battered housewives maybe. It's kind of complex. The women and children argument is often used to defend settler colonies, but what about someone who's like, well, if they're like 7 years old, then they're not a combatant. They're just along for the ride, basically. But it is something that we should at least address, even if we're not talking to these children directly. It's often something that I wonder about, like what happens to them. And I think the simple solution is they just go somewhere else with their families. But it is something I wondered about all the same. But yeah, so this video has been talking about, liberal Zionism, white moderacy, centrism, and various other things, and how sometimes I take contention with Bad Empanada, who clumps anarcho-communists with liberalism and sexually progressive behaviors like polycules and polyamory with liberals. It's a very Marxist Leninist and Maoist kind of thing, a Stalinist kind of thing, a little bit. It's kind of tanky behavior, if I'm honest. And he has this tendency to sort of paint things in black and white. He's right about, a lot of things, but he's also really, really fucking wrong about a lot of things and painting in broad strokes. So I'd happily debate him about all of that if he would like to debate me, but he doesn't debate people who are high-hanging fruit. He goes after the most obvious examples. He thinks that's the best use of his time, and I would argue that it's important to go after, IDF soldiers, absolutely. But he never has, conversations with ANCOMs. He has conversations with Marxist Leninists, just as far as I can tell, anyways. And I've been following him for a long time, and also, talking about, sex doctors and BDSM doctors and stuff like that, and that's not real. And how would he fucking know? So there's shit like that I'm convinced that he's actually pretty regressive, the way that Marxist Leninists often are when it comes to queer rights and the rights of workers in a sexual and gender sense. And there is a tremendous social component. It's not just material conditions, it's socio-material conditions, and that often includes a queer element too that Marxist Leninists don't like to touch. They tend to shy away from it. So those are my thoughts about that. Bad Empanada, you know how to find me. I've emailed you before, you don't respond. But I do support your work on Palestine. Keep up the good work as far as that goes. I think, I'm going to needle you about certain things, but by and large, you are basically correct about Palestine and the one-state solution. You're wrong about ANCOMs by and large, but that's okay. That's a conversation for another time. In any event, this video turned out to be longer than I expected. It's probably going on 2 hours at this point, but that's okay. This is unscripted, and it's just something I'm doing for fun. In any event, I'm going to cut this one short. Thanks for watching. If you liked it, like, share, and subscribe if you have thoughts and feelings. A lot of times I don't respond to the comments because usually I'll just save them and make a video about them later if I feel like it. I also, invigilating and writing and illustrating a book series, and I'm still, working with people on that. That's the lion's share of the work that I'm doing, but I also support, the Palestinians and a one-state solution and dismantling the state. Capitalism bad. The bourgeoisie are bad, all cops are bad, so on and so forth. There's a lot I could say, but by and large, that's what I'm doing. This video is just for fun, and who knows what I'll talk about next, but until next time, stay tuned and take care.